Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today I wanted to go ahead and try something a bit different. With the Age of Annihilus ending and the Age of Fear right around the corner, I wanted to go ahead and make some predictions on the next year of teams. Between the Vision video, the live Q&A, the anniversary teases, and especially everything hidden in Ryan Jacobson's room, there are just way too many clues to ignore. So today, I'm going to predict every major team that could be coming over the next year of Marvel Strike Force. And to make sure these predictions aren't completely baseless, the main image I'll be using as the foundation of these predictions will be this one right here. But to reiterate, these predictions are built from all the little hints, teases, and even direct confirmations that Scopely have given us throughout the 2026 Vision video, the live Q&A, and the 8th anniversary celebration video. Of course, none of this is set in stone, and some of this could absolutely just be us overanalyzing the background details. But there is so much to look at, especially in Ryan Jacobson's room at the end of the Vision video, which is why I couldn't help but make this video. Before we jump into the actual team predictions, we first need to establish what we know for sure about the upcoming Age of Fear. The first major thing is that the Best Buddies team is going to be important early on, specifically during Chapter 1. Because of that, I think this team is intentionally temporary, and over the course of the year, we'll slowly see each member get reworked and moved on to brand new teams. With the one big exception being Deadpool, who already has a long-term home on Retcon for this next year. The second thing we know is that sometime next year we'll be getting Battleworld 4, which will feature the Destroyer as the main villain after Maestro. While that doesn't directly point to any one team, it does reinforce what already feels obvious. This age is going to lean heavily into an Asgardian theme. And the final major piece is that this entire age is clearly inspired by the Fear Itself comic storyline. Now, we still don't know how closely Scopely plans to follow the source material, but that gives us two possible lanes for predictions. Some of these teams will be based on what makes the most sense for Marvel Strike Force, while others may line up more directly with the actual comic canon if Scopely decides to stay closer to the original story. Now that we've got that established, let's kick off into the first team that I think will mark the beginning of the Age of Fear. Presumably arriving next month in May, that team would be none other than the West Coast Avengers. This is one of those teams where I could see Scopely going with either 2 or 3 reworks, so I'll break down both possibilities. If it's a 3 rework structure like we've been seeing more recently, then we'd only get 2 new characters, which I believe would be Julia Carpenter's Spider-Woman and the long-requested Wonder Man. But if it's only 2 reworks, then I think they could round out this team with someone like Crimson Dynamo as that final addition, specifically the Valentine Shadowlaw variant. And thankfully, he was a former member of this team, and since we got the rest of the Winter Guard in the game already, that could mean he gets the Winter Guard tag too. Of course, it's also worth mentioning that the Winter Guard Dynamo does vary from the West Coast Dynamo, but I think it could work within the confines of Marvel Strike Force. Now, onto the reworks for the West Coast Avengers. I think there's a few options here, but some of these make more sense than others to me. Firstly, I'd say Captain America is definitely a lock for this team. This would make him the first character to move off of the Best Buddies and into a completely new team, fitting perfectly into the idea of that team slowly being redistributed over the course of this year. Alongside him, I think Hawkeye is next in line. He's a core West Coast Avenger, and more importantly, he's the last major Avenger who hasn't received a modern rework yet. But if there is a third rework here, I think Mockingbird makes the most sense. However, I can also see a strong argument being made for Kate Bishop among the others shown here. Not to mention, both Kate and Mockingbird have strong ties to the West Coast Avengers, as well as Clint Barton. And on top of all of that, Mockingbird actually plays a role in the Fear Itself storyline, which could give this team a nice thematic connection to this age. But what makes me believe in this team? Well, firstly, this takes us back to what we talked about earlier. If the Best Buddies is meant to be a temporary team, then that would make this a perfect spot for Captain America to go. Secondly, in the 2026 Vision video, there's a figure on the shelf in the background just behind Ryan Jacobson, of a character who isn't in Marvel Strike Force yet. That figure is of Julia Carpenter's Spider-Woman, which is what led me to placing her on this team. And lastly, is this print that can be seen on the shelf next to the Captain America shield, which is currently hidden behind Ryan's head, so I went ahead and pictured the exact print off to the right instead. In this image, we can see a lot of Avengers and characters we already have in the game, with the exception of one very hidden character who can be seen in the bottom right corner just beneath Iron Man, and that character turns out to be none other than Wonder Man. Moving into June, this is where I believe we will get a brand new X-Men team that will be heavily inspired by the animated series, specifically the X-Men 97 series. The most obvious new addition here would be Morph. If Scopely wants to capitalize on the X-Men 97 hype, he's basically the perfect choice since he's the only major member of that core team who still isn't in Marvel Strike Force. Alongside Morph, I think we will also see Banshee and Angel, both of whom have strong ties to the animated series and would help round this team out into something that feels very classic X-Men. Now when it comes to the reworks, this one actually feels pretty straightforward despite how many options there are. The first rework would be Wolverine, and honestly, this feels almost guaranteed. If we're following the theory that every Best Buddies character is getting redistributed this year, then this is the perfect place for him to land. The second rework, and the one I feel nearly as confident about, is Colossus. But as I said, there's plenty of options for an X-Men 97 style team. But I don't think Scopely are ready to disband the Uncanny Avengers yet, so Jean, Beast, and Storm are likely not happening, and while Jubilee has lots of evidence pointing to her getting something this year, I actually have her somewhere else in this list later on. So what makes an X-Men 97 team feel so likely? The biggest reason is timing. Season 2 of X-Men 97 is expected later this summer, and June lands right in that perfect promotional window for Scopely to capitalize on the hype. The second clue is something we've already seen in the 8th anniversary video. Multiple times throughout that video, there's a Colossus statue sitting on the shelf behind Pathfinder, and to me, that feels way too deliberate to ignore. It also lines up nicely with the fact that Magic was reworked late last year for New Mutants, which makes Colossus finally getting his turn feel more possible. This team would also continue the Best Buddies theory perfectly, as this team would give Wolverine a brand new team. And the last big piece of evidence comes from the 2 comic prints in Ryan Jacobson's room that we've been using as the backbone for a lot of these predictions. The reason I specifically landed on Banshee is because he appears in the Death of Wolverine cover just between Colossus and Wolverine. And for Angel, the clue comes from the Uncanny X-Men print where he can be seen flying around Colossus just above Cyclops' optic blast. When you combine the release timing, the Colossus statue, Wolverine's relocation, and both comic prints, this one starts to feel extremely hard to ignore as a possibility. But to suggest an alternative to the X-Men 97 prediction, I do want to throw out another possibility that ties into the actual Fear Itself comics. While I believe the X-Men 97 team is the more likely headline release for June, Scopely could lean harder into the comic storyline. With this alternative team, this could work as either the main team or even a secondary background style team similar to Retcon or Secret Warriors. During Fear Itself Uncanny X-Force, there's a team made up of Deadpool, Wolverine, Archangel, Psylocke, and Phantom X. What makes this especially interesting is that it still solves the same problem we talked about earlier. It gives Wolverine a perfect rework destination while also bringing relevance back to 3 much older mutants in Psylocke, Archangel, and Phantom X. Since I still believe Deadpool remains on Retcon for most, if not all, of this year, that will leave one open slot for Scopely to get creative with. And in that scenario, I could absolutely see this becoming another MSF original remix team, where they only introduce one new character, similar to how Jeff or Phantom Rider were used on their teams. That final slot could be where they sneak in someone like Banshee or Angel, especially if the full X-Men 97 team doesn't happen in the exact way I predicted. So, while I still lean X-Men 97 overall, this feels like one of the most realistic comic accurate backup options they could pivot to. As we move into July, this is where I think we will finally get the long-awaited Symbiote 6 team, which honestly feels like one of the easiest predictions on this entire roadmap. Scopely has already confirmed that a massive Spider-Man event is happening later this year, and to me, July makes the most sense for when it comes, especially with Spider-Man Brand New Day releasing at the end of this month. So right away, the one thing we know for sure is that Symbiote Quicksilver is going to be a part of this team, since that's the community vote that ended up winning. Alongside him, I think we get 2 more new symbiotes, and while there are a lot of possible options here, my personal picks would be Riot and Toxin. That being said, this is definitely one of those teams where there's a lot of wiggle room depending on which symbiote Scopely wants to go with. Now for the reworks, there are a few believable options like Agent Venom, Anti-Venom, or even Scream, but I actually think the most likely choices are the most obvious ones, those being Symbiote Spider-Man and Venom. The reason I feel so confident there is because Scopely has already confirmed that Venom is getting updates sometime this year, and I think it could easily lend to more than one Peter Parker for the month as it lines up perfectly with the Spider-Man event. Off to the side, I also included the original Spider-Man, because if July really is the month we see the Spider-Man event, this feels like the perfect time to continue the Best Buddies breakup and finally give him his next major update. The real question would then be, where does that Spider-Man rework actually go? Does he become part of the Symbiote 6 despite not actually being a symbiote? Or will he be a standalone event rework? Maybe Scopely uses this as an excuse to refresh a wider group of Spider-based characters, similar to what we've seen with teams like Infestation or the broader Sinister Six tag rework a while back. If it does end up being a broader Spider-Verse rework, then I could absolutely see other Spider characters getting touched up too, like Scarlet Spider, Spider-Punk, and maybe even Spider-Noir, especially with the live-action Noir series coming to Amazon sometime in May. With the confirmed event, the community vote, the announced Venom updates, and the new movie on its way, this one feels extremely likely, and we already know this team is on its way. The next team would be for August, which would also be when Chapter 2 of the Age of Fear begins, and I think it kicks off with one of the teams we already know is coming this year, the Eternals. Because the Eternals roster has so many possible options, this is one of the harder teams to pin down exactly. But the three new additions I landed on are Thena, Kingo, and Phastos. Those three feel like strong choices because they're recognizable and each bring something different to the team. But honestly, with how many major Eternals characters are still available, there's a lot of room for Scopely to go in different directions here. The part I feel much more confident about is the role that this team will play. I strongly suspect this ends up being the next Arena team, especially since by August, it would have been just over a year since the MCU Fantastic Four took over that spot in the meta. That timing alone makes this feel like the perfect place for a refresh, but the Eternals also used to dominate Arena, which is what leads me to this belief. As for the reworks, this one barely needs any debate. It's almost certainly going to be Circe and Icarus, as they are still the only Eternals in Marvel Strike Force. And with Scopely finally expanding that tag into a full modern team, those two are the obvious picks for a rework. However, I did also put Hyperion here as an option, though I'm less confident he'll receive anything as it may be too soon for a rework. But then again, the Thunderbolts have already been axed, which makes Hyperion available and impossible to rule this idea out. Moving into September, this is one of the months I'm less confident in, but I still think there's a very real chance we see some kind of new Guardians of the Galaxy team. For the new additions, the two names I landed on are Kraglin and an MCU-inspired Phyla-Vell. I specifically say MCU Phyla-Vell because I don't think the current version of her in the game will be getting a rework. Instead, this feels more like an opportunity for Scopely to bring in the Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 version of the character as a separate character. And Kraglin just feels like a natural next step for expanding the current Guardians roster, especially if they want this team to lean more into the modern MCU lineup. As for the reworks, I actually feel a lot better here. The safest bets to me are Gamora and Drax, with Mantis as the third rework. Realistically though, you can make an argument for just about any of the older Guardians because most of them are very outdated at this point. If Scopely wants to push this more toward the Volume 3 ending in the MCU though, then I could also see Cosmo taking that third slot instead of Mantis. The main reason I think the Guardians are at least getting something this year comes down to one specific clue. This print on the wall in the Vision video. On that print, we see 5 major Guardians characters, but what makes it interesting is that 3 of them have already been updated recently. Groot and Rocket are still part of the Starjammers, and Star-Lord just got placed on the Galactic Council. That only leaves us with Gamora and Drax as the 2 obvious loose ends, which is exactly why I am so confident that both of them are part of something later this year. Whether that ends up being a full new Guardians team or a smaller Guardians tag refresh, I do think those two are almost certainly involved in some way. Now, like I said, I'm still less confident in the Guardians prediction for September, so as a backup idea, I actually think this could be the perfect month for us to get our first proper Asgardian team for the Age of Fear. From a thematic standpoint alone, this might make even more sense. If Scopely are going to lean into the Fear Itself storyline and the larger Asgardian tone of this age, then at some point we almost have to get a major Asgardian focused team. The one new character I feel the most confident about here is Angela. I'm extremely confident she shows up somewhere during this age, and a hero-based Asgardian team feels like the most natural place for her. Alongside Angela, I also added Fandral. The Warriors 3 do play a role in the fight against the Serpent in the comics, and out of those three, Fandral feels like the most recognizable and most likely choice for Scopely to prioritize. For the last new addition, I went with Balder Odinson, another one of Thor's brothers. Now, I'll be honest, Balder is the slot I'm least attached to here. He's not especially central to the Fear Itself storyline, so I could absolutely see Scopely swapping him out for another Warrior 3 member, or even using this slot as a third rework instead. But as a pure hero Asgardian fantasy pick, I think he works really well. As for the reworks, there are a lot of possible directions, but the two I think make the most sense are Thor and Valkyrie. Both of them play important roles in the Fear Itself comics, and they naturally fit the identity of a hero Asgardian team. And honestly, having an Asgardian-themed age without a major Thor rework would just feel wrong. If Scopely decided to go in a slightly different direction, I could also see options like Heimdall, Sif, or even Vol, especially since they've shown they like keeping their MSF original characters relevant and in the meta. Alright, let's talk about October, which would bring the final team of Chapter 2 for the Age of Fear, and it lines up perfectly with Halloween. Now, this is easily one of my least certain predictions, but I still think there's a fun and realistic direction Scopely could go in here. So, for this month, I went with a brand new sorcery-based team, and as for the new characters, I went with Nightmare, Clea, and Blackheart. Overall, this would be a very villain-heavy mystical team, which fits perfectly for Halloween. However, these are some pretty big names that could easily scale into future legendary or even mythic characters down the line, so the likelihood these would even be the characters on a team like this is rather slim. And for the reworks, there are quite a few possibilities, but I tried to keep it primarily villain-focused. I don't expect Doctor Strange to get another rework, though you can never fully roll it out after reworks like Sunspot have happened so soon. Beyond Doctor Strange, I also doubt Heartless Strange would be reworked anytime soon, since Brimstone would only just be wrapping up around this time in terms of their relevancy. So, that leaves the rest of these characters as fair game. If I had to pick, I'd love to see Dormammu and Morgan Le Fay get reworks, but realistically, I think Scopely might focus on duos like Scarlet Witch and Agatha, or Dr. Voodoo and Nico Monroe, to balance new mystical characters with existing ones. As for why this team even came to mind, there's only a small piece of possible evidence, and that's this print we see in the Vision video, which I'd love to think is teasing Dormammu, but it could just as easily be a hint at Strange, especially since he played a role in the Fear Itself storyline. So in short, this is my fun and flimsy prediction of the video that could easily change. There's no solid evidence for it, but it's a fun idea for a Halloween release, and a team that could stand out as a major Mystic-based team if Scopely do explore this idea. And that brings us to the start of Chapter 3. And I think this is where the roadmap starts to get really exciting. This is what I believe to be one of the most guaranteed teams of the entire next year, and that team is Generation X. Much like a few earlier predictions, I think this could go in either a 2 new character or 3 new character structure. If it's only 2 new additions, then my picks are Chamber and Monet, also known as Pennis. But if Scopely goes with the more traditional 3 character setup, then I think Husk would become the 3rd addition to this team. Now, when it comes to the reworks, there's one character I'm completely locked in on, and that's Jubilee, who has got to be 100% guaranteed for this team. We'll get into the evidence in a second, But before that, I also think this is the moment where the best buddies theory finally reaches its conclusion. The final character still waiting for a new home is Dakin, and this feels like the perfect place to put him. Now yes, traditionally Dakin is not a Generation X character, but this is exactly the kind of creative twist Scopely loves to do with modern teams from time to time, so I could absolutely see it happening here. Alongside Jubilee and Dakin, I also included Emma Frost, specifically her X-Men variant, as an optional third rework. Since Emma was one of the former leaders of Generation X, she fits naturally, and I just don't see them reworking the original Emma again so soon after the Hellfire Club patch from last year. And to me, the X-Men version of Emma simply fits this team identity much better anyways. Now let's talk about why I'm so confident, because the evidence for this team, or at the very least Jubilee, is honestly kind of overwhelming. First, in the Vision video, there's a comic cover of Uncanny X-Men sitting next to the Hulk figure on the shelf. What makes that comic so important here is that it marks the first ever appearance of Jubilee. Honestly, that clue alone makes it feel almost guaranteed that she's involved somewhere this year, and Generation X is by far the best fit if you ask me. But the evidence doesn't stop there. During the live Q&A for the 2026 Vision, we also saw Pathfinder wearing an X-Men shirt, and it was specifically mentioned that a certain she would be important this year that appears on this shirt. At that point, the only options were Storm, Rogue, or Jubilee. And as much as I would personally love to see Rogue return to the meta, all signs here point much more strongly toward Jubilee. Then, if that somehow still wasn't enough, the 8th anniversary celebration video gives us one more massive clue, which is the statues of both Jubilee and Emma Frost. At this point, Jubilee feels incredibly obvious, and it's also the biggest reason I think Emma X-Men has a real shot at being a part of this team, depending on how Scopely structures it. And finally, if Dakin lands here too, then by the end of November we can officially say the Best Buddies team is fully dead, with every member finally redistributed across the Age of Fear roadmap. As 2026 starts to wrap up, we already know there will be a major in-game event celebrating Avengers Doomsday, which is currently set to release in late December. Now, we still don't know any details on this event, but I'm almost certain that this is when we will get Doctor Doom MCU and Marvel Strike Force, which could happen either in December itself or possibly spilling over into early January, depending on when the event actually starts. The bigger question is whether this event leads to a full Doomsday-themed team, or if it plays out more like a massive event centered around one huge character. Personally, as much as I'd love to see a full dedicated Doomsday team with this event, I actually think the more realistic outcome is that this acts as a secondary event team for December, with Doctor Doom MCU coming into the game as a solo release. But even if that's the case, I don't think that's the end of Doomsday's impact on the roster. In fact, I think the real focus of this event will be a large-scale rework wave of fan-favorite characters who are expected to appear in the movie. The safest guesses are the Avengers who, by this point in the year, still haven't been reworked elsewhere. So characters like Hulk, Iron Man, and Black Widow immediately come to mind. I could also see them bringing the Infinity War variants of Thor and Iron Man up as a way to make the event feel just that much more connected to the MCU. Beyond them, I have also included characters like Franklin Richards, especially after seeing Doom with him at the end of Fantastic Four First Steps, which feels like a possible setup for something in the Doomsday movie. Of course, there are tons of possibilities for a Doomsday rework wave like this, and what I have shown here really only scratches the surface of possibilities. Now on the other hand, while Doomsday may dominate the event side of December, I think the focal point will be on a team that goes in a very different direction. My prediction for December is some kind of villain Asgardian, or at the very least, Fear itself adjacent team. And yeah, I know on paper this lineup can look a little messy, but walk with me. The first character I added here is Sin, or Cynthia Schmidt. Now obviously, she isn't an Asgardian, but in the Fear Itself comics, she becomes Scotty, one of the worthy empowered by the Serpent. That's why I chose her normal version here instead of the full Breaker form, because I believe the Breakers are going to be the chapter legendary team later in this age, and I don't think Sin herself makes the final Breaker or worthy roster. The second villain is Enchantress, and just like Angela from earlier, I am very confident this character is coming this year. First, we just recently got confirmation of Executioner for the upcoming Shadow Conclave team, and her connection to him makes this a really natural follow-up. Second, out of all the major villain Asgardians missing, Enchantress just feels like one of the most overdue additions in the entire game. The last new addition I went with is Grey Gargoyle. Much like Sin, he isn't technically Asgardian, but he's a classic Thor villain, and more importantly, he also becomes one of the worthy during Fear itself. So, while I don't think he ends up as one of the actual Breakers later, this feels like the perfect place to still represent that storyline. However, I could see a bit of a stronger team being placed here for villain Asgardians rather than my idea. Who knows, Enchantress could be an epic similar to Blue Marvel, who was the epic during the Age of Annihilus. Just depends on how Scopely approach the storyline and how close they stick to it or how far they stray from it. As for the reworks, there are honestly a lot of Asgardian options as I mentioned earlier, but my personal picks for this team are going to be Loki and Teen Loki. I think those two make the most sense for a couple of reasons. For one, Sylvie is already getting reworked for Shadow Conclave, so it would make a lot of sense for Scopely to continue refreshing the Loki side of the roster this year. But more importantly, both Loki and Teen Loki actually play roles in the Fear Itself comics, which gives this team a strong thematic anchor. And much like I said earlier with Thor, having an Asgardian-focused age without a meaningful Loki rework would almost feel criminal, especially right after Sylvie gets her turn. And as a cherry on top, giving Loki a rework in December when the Doomsday event will likely happen also goes hand in hand as he is set to appear in that movie as well. Alright, let's talk about a team I'm personally very excited for, and one that Scopely has already mentioned a few times as an idea that's been floating around. I think this becomes the final team of Chapter 3, and honestly, it would be the perfect way to kick off the new year while also closing out the chapter, and I believe that will be none other than the 2099 team. This is one of the most flexible concepts in the entire roadmap because there are so many directions Scopely could take with it. For my personal picks, I went with the three characters I'd want to see most on this team. Those being Captain America, Ghost Rider, and Moon Knight 2099. But like I said, the possibilities here are almost endless. You could just as easily make cases for Venom 2099, Hulk 2099, Doctor Doom 2099, the several X-Men of 2099, or even Deadpool 2099, as she was on a past community vote when the Mercs for Money team were first coming around. This is just one of those teams where the exact lineup is simply going to be unknown until a proper announcement, but their potential is definitely there. Now when it comes to the reworks, this is where things get a little trickier, but I think there's still some solid logic behind my choices. Let's get the obvious one out of the way first. There is no way Spider-Man 2099 isn't a part of this team. He's the only character in the game who is already labeled as 2099, and on top of that, he's still one of the most iconic Spider-Man variants Marvel has. So that one feels very obvious. The second slot is where things get tricky. One option I included was Penny Parker, specifically the Into the Spider-Verse version. Now yes, technically she's from the year 3145, not 2099 in the movie, but from a pure futuristic perspective, she still fits the overall identity really well. That said, I'd also really like if both reworks weren't Spider characters. So, when I looked across the current roster, the only two names that stood out to me were Bishop and Cable. Since both of them are heavily tied to time travel and future timelines, they can logically fit the futuristic side of a 2099 team even if they aren't directly from that universe. And this could even go back to making Deadpool 2099 all the more possible as a new addition. This is definitely one of the trickier rework predictions though, so if there's someone obvious I'm missing, I'd love to hear other possibilities in the comments. Alright, for February, I think we kick off the final chapter of the Age of Fear with a brand new Sinister Six style team that I'm personally dubbing the Ferocious Six. This is where I think we finally get the long requested Sandman alongside Chameleon and Tombstone. Sandman and Chameleon already make a ton of sense for this kind of team, which we'll get to, but Tombstone is the one I wanted to explain a little bit more right now. The main reason I added him is because Spider-Man Brand New Day should make him a much more mainstream villain this year, which means he'll be way more recognizable across the broader player base. Due to that, I think he has a real chance to be on a team like this, and he fits well as the third new addition instead of going deeper into more obscure classic Spider-Man villains. As for the reworks, there are honestly a lot of directions Scope could go. If they really wanted to go for the older untouched characters, I could see something like Rhino and Electro. But if it were up to me, I think most players would much rather see this lean into a more classic Sinister Six team. That's why my personal rework picks would be Green Goblin Classic and Dr. Octopus. You could also easily make strong cases for characters like Mysterio, Kraven the Hunter, or Lizard, but Green Goblin and Doc Ock just make the team feel the most iconic. As for why I think this team is actually coming, it really comes down to this print from the Vision video. There are a lot of Spider-Man villains featured here, but the ones that stand out as characters that are not currently in the game are Sandman, Chameleon, and the Enforcers. To me, Sandman and Chameleon feel like pretty good and fitting additions for the game. And while the Enforcers are definitely possible as well, I'm just not so sure that they have the same level of hype or recognition, which is why I personally went with Tombstone as the third character, especially with the extra momentum he should get from Brand New Day. The next team would put us in March, and I'm thinking this is where we could finally see a new Wakanda team. For this lineup, I went with White Wolf, Storm as the Wakandan Queen, and W'Kabi. With these picks, the team would bring in T'Challa's adopted brother and White Wolf, his wife through Storm as the Wakandan Queen, and W'Kabi as one of T'Challa's closest allies and best friend. Together, that makes the team feel very centered around T'Challa's family and inner circle, even with the tension present between the brothers. Although my confidence level for this team isn't the highest, I really hope it happens, or at the very least, that something new comes for the Wakandans, because this side of the roster feels very overdue for something new. With the reworks, you could honestly make a case for just about any Wakandan character, since that side of the roster is pretty old at this point. But with this team concept being centered around T'Challa and his inner circle, the most obvious picks would be Black Panther, who I'd say is a lock, and the original Shuri, as they fit the family dynamic of this team perfectly. That being said, I can also see a case for Killmonger over Shuri, especially with them being cousins, and his inclusion would only add to the tension that's already rooted into this team between the brothers. You could even argue for Nakia, as she is T'Challa's love interest in the MCU, but to me, that would feel a bit odd considering Storm's inclusion on this team. The main reason I believe the Wakandans will be getting something new this year is due to this comic cover seen in the Vision video. To me, it feels like an obvious hint towards Black Panther's rework this year, and potentially even a new Wakandan team. And to throw in a wild card alternative, it could even point to a rework for Star-Lord T'Challa, especially when you factor in both the Black Panther and Guardian seasons that I was otherwise skeptical of from the beginning. Either way, I definitely think we'll be seeing something new for T'Challa this year. It's just a matter of how. And last but not least, we reach the final month of the Age of Fear, which puts us in April of 2027, and with it, I believe we'll get two major new teams. The first, and easily the biggest, would be the Worthy or Breakers, depending on what Scope decides to call them. This team would likely function just like the Galactic Council did during the Age of Annihilus, a super team made up of the major legendary characters introduced throughout the Age of Fear. But who makes this final roster? The two obvious locks to me are Cole Borson, the Serpent, who I believe serves as the mythic centerpiece, and Silver Surfer Breaker, who Scopely has already confirmed as the first Breaker who will arrive in Chapter 1 between May and July. For the second Breaker slot, my current prediction is Captain Marvel, though I'll admit I'm not fully locked in on that. However, Scopely posted an image that was very clearly AI generated, so it's hard to know how accurately it reflects the intended character. But taking it at face value, it appears to show a blonde woman, and to me, Captain Marvel is the best fit. That being said, I wouldn't rule out something like Invisible Woman or Classic Valkyrie becoming a Breaker either. The third breaker I currently have is Juggernaut, and to be honest, this one is mostly here because I think he would look incredibly cool in the game. Unfortunately, there isn't a ton of hard evidence behind his inclusion, and if this age only ends up giving us 3 breakers with the Serpent, just like how the Age of Annihilus worked, then Juggernaut is probably the one that is most likely to get cut. The fourth and final breaker in my version of this team is Breaker Hulk. Ideally, this team wouldn't have any reworks unlike the Galactic Council, but the ideal solution is not the likely solution. So let's say Scopely does include reworks on the Breaker or Worthy team, and only 3 new legendaries accompany the Serpent. In that case, I think the rework pool would most likely fall between Juggernaut, Hulk, Red Hulk, Absorbing Man, Titania, and the Thing. Juggernaut is here mainly because, in this version, he's the most likely new breaker to get cut from my otherwise ideal roster. The rest of these picks are heavily inspired by the Fear Itself comics. Characters like the Thing, Hulk, Titania, Absorbing Man all become breakers in the storyline, making all of them possibilities if the team gets a couple reworks rather than a completely new set of characters. I also threw Red Hulk in here mostly for fun, but I could see Scopely taking a slightly more original direction and giving him the Hulk spot on this team, or even reworking him alongside a legendary Breaker Hulk. Red Hulk is also worth mentioning here due to this print shown in the Vision video, which is also the last major one we haven't touched on yet. Now to me, I saw this more like a tease for Hulk eventually becoming one of the Worthy rather than a simple Hulk or Red Hulk rework, which is why I believe he'll be a breaker this year. But it's still possible both Hulk variants get some kind of update because they are important to the Fear Itself storyline. I just think the bigger payoff would be Hulk joining as the final breaker of the team. So yeah, this would be my ideal version of the breakers, and honestly, I really hope Scopely keeps this as a full premium super team rather than relying on any reworks. To end this video with a big bang, I want to talk about what I think would be the headline April 2027 team releasing alongside the breakers for the anniversary. If this year's structure is anything to go by, the 9-year anniversary should also be dropping sometime in April. And if they really want to celebrate both the game and Marvel as a whole, I think the best possible choice would be Avengers Prime. This one is absolutely subject to change, but it's a fun idea for an anniversary team. For the new additions, my personal picks would be Avenger Prime, Weapon America, and Tony Stark's Ant-Man. However, there are definitely other routes they could go. These 3 just feel like the most exciting and anniversary-worthy options to me. What I really love about this team is that it feels like the perfect reflection of 9 years of Marvel Strike Force, while also being a great way of celebrating the IP of Marvel itself. As for the reworks, there are actually more options here than I had originally expected. Characters like Vision, Hercules, Black Knight, multiple Captain America variants, and even Captain Marvel all make sense depending on how broad they want the Avengers Prime team to be. If it were purely my choice, I'd have to pick between Black Knight, Captain Marvel, and Hank Pym to get those reworks. But if I were to predict Scopely's more realistic path, I think something like Vision and Captain Carter feels a little bit more likely. And with that, those are my full predictions for the entire next year of Marvel Strike Force during the Age of Fear. I'm looking forward to coming back to this video over the next year and seeing how much of this ends up being accurate and how much of Ryan Jacobson's room I may have completely overanalyzed. But now I want to hear from you. What do you think of these predictions? Which teams do you agree with, and which ones do you think I'm completely off on? Are there any teams you'd move around to different months, or any characters you think are locks that I completely missed? I'd love to keep this discussion going in the comments, because with this many clues and possible teases, there are a ton of different directions Scopely could still take. So drop your own predictions below, and we'll see who gets the closest early next year. And until next time, thank you for watching.